Hey everyone, in this video we're going to come back to Latin adjectives and think about how we use them. So in previous videos we talked about what they are and the declensions for them, but now we want to think about something called noun-adjective agreement. So the question we're really after is how do we use them with nouns, right? How do you take a Latin adjective and make it match with a Latin noun, which is basically the whole idea of why we'd use them in Latin, right? So we want to make sure that we understand that process. It's a little complicated at first because it's different from English, but once you get used to it, it's actually pretty straightforward. So we want to start with this question again. What is an adjective? Let's just make sure that we're feeling good about that before we move forward. Otherwise, this is going to be very confusing. So you want to remember an adjective, Latin, English, doesn't matter. It's a word that describes a noun or a pronoun. So words like hot, happy, cold, sad, whatever, these are all adjectives. Or you could even use it in a sentence, the hungry lion, hungry is an adjective. And again, maybe he's looking at the delicious bunnies. Delicious would be an adjective. Okay. So once you have the flow of how these work, you can dive in and think about how they're going to work in Latin. So with that in mind, hopefully we're feeling pretty good on what an adjective is. Let's get started. So before we worry about the Latin, let's think about English. How do we use adjectives in English? Okay. Because this will help you understand why it's a little different and unpack what we need to before we dive into using Latin adjectives. Okay. So what do you notice about these sentences? If you were to look at these and see the happy boy, the happy girl, the happy alien, the happy flower, and the happy dog, right? What do you notice about these? The word happy hasn't changed. So the adjective happy is spelled the exact same way, no matter what noun it's going with. So it could be describing a boy, a girl, an alien, a flower, a dog. It doesn't matter. It's not going to change, okay? So that's a really important note. We very rarely change the spelling of an adjective to match a noun. The only time we really do this is with numbers in English, right? So you wouldn't want to say, oh, I see the 7 dog. You'd want to say the 7 dogs, right? 7 would have to go with a plural noun. That's the only time where you really see this noun-adjective agreement. Otherwise, we really don't change the spelling of our adjectives or how we use them. It always stays the same. But now let's take a look at Latin. What do you notice about these Latin sentences? Well, we have puella laeta, which means the happy girl, puer laetus, which means the happy boy, and aedificium laetum, which means the happy building. But look at the adjective here. We have laeta, laetus, and laetum. We've changed the ending depending on what we're describing. So they all mean happy. Laeta, laetus, and laetum all mean the exact same thing. So why did we change the ending? Right? What's going on here? This is where it gets a little confusing, particularly for my students just starting out in Latin, right? Understanding that we're changing the ending of the adjective depending on what we're describing. So there's actually a bunch of different ways in Latin you can say happy. It's not as simple as just one word. So this is a really important note to get. In Latin, we change the spelling of the adjective depending on the noun that it's describing. This is what we call agreement. So you heard me say that at the beginning of the video, that this concept is called noun-adjective agreement. This is what we mean. We say that an adjective agrees with a noun, meaning that it's gonna change the way it's spelled to match the noun. If you want to think of it that way, it just means matching is really what it is. Okay? So here's an important note. Nouns don't change their gender. Right? So the word girl will always be feminine, the word boy will always be masculine, and the word building will always be neuter, right? The gender does not change, and we've talked about that before. But adjectives are more like chameleons. That's a metaphor I like to use in my class. It's like a chameleon. It's going to change depending on what's around it, right? So you know how chameleons can change their color? Same thing here. Adjectives, rather, will change, not their color, but the ending to match the noun. This is where it's very different and something you want to unpack so you can understand what's happening in the Latin and not get thrown off. So the 3 ways that adjectives match their noun, and again, notice how I'm saying adjectives match nouns, not the other way around. It's not, you don't change the noun to match with an adjective. The adjective will change to match the noun. So make sure you have that clear in your mind. The adjective is the chameleon here. So when dealing with noun-adjective agreement, the 3 ways they're going to match are case, number, and gender. So save those terms and let's unpack each of them to see what we're talking about. Okay? So the first one we mentioned is case. And you want to remember the case of a noun is how it's being used in a sentence. And we've talked about this before. You can take a look at one of my previous videos and you'll see it. But it's, either a subject, a direct object, maybe you're showing possession. How is it being used? The cases in Latin, the 6 main ones, are nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, ablative, and vocative. So when we say the case of a noun or an adjective, this is what we're talking about. So if you have a noun that's nominative, the adjective needs to be nominative. And if your noun is genitive, your adjective needs to be genitive. It's pretty straightforward. It has to be the exact same, right? So here's an example. In the first line, we have Julia est puella laeta, right? Julia is a happy girl. Puella and laeta are both nominative. Then we have Marcus puellam laetam videt. Marcus sees the happy girl. Puellam and laitam are both accusative, and notice how the ending had to change to an am, right? That's the accusative singular ending. Then you have ego willam puelai laitai video. So I see, video, ego video, right? The house of the happy girl, puelai laitai. That ae ending, again, we changed it. It's genitive, so it's of the happy girl. Then we have pecuniam puelai laitai trado, right? I hand over money to the happy girl. Puelai laitai, it's dative, right? And you can tell by the context here that it would be dative case. Then the last one we have cum puella laita ambulo. I walk with the happy girl. Puella laita, right? With the long A, they're ablative. So when you change the case, you have to change it for the noun and the adjective. They both need to change. So for example, you would never say something like puella laitam, right? That wouldn't make sense. Just like you wouldn't say puelai laita, right? You have to make the endings match. You're not going to go mixing. Whatever case your noun is, that's the case the adjective needs to be. Okay? The second way that they match is in number. Number is very straightforward. Is it singular or plural? That's all we're really talking about. So here's an example. If we had puella laita, the happy girl, puella and laita are singular. But if I have the happy girls, now it becomes puellai laitai, right? I changed puella to puellai. I made it plural. So I had to change laita to laitai so that they're both nominative plural, right? Same thing down below, just a different case. These are accusative. You have puellam laitam video. I see the happy girl. Would become puellas laitas video. I see the happy girls. Again, the idea here is that the adjective happy is changing its ending depending on the noun, which is puella, the girl, right? And it'll change to match whatever the case and the number are. That's what it needs to be. The last one we have is gender. And again, the gender of a noun is whether it's masculine, feminine, or neuter. And I put a link here. You can check out the video I made on what gender is in Latin just to get a quick overview of how we use gender and how we understand it. But for our purposes here, is it masculine, feminine, or neuter? Okay. So if we look at an adjective chart, it would look like this. These are what we call first and second declension adjectives. We'll talk about them in a second. They have three different columns because an adjective can be either masculine, feminine, or neuter, and it's going to use different endings depending on what gender it is. So again, there's not one fixed gender for adjectives. It's not that they don't have gender. It's more that they can be any gender. They're going to match whatever the noun is, right? So this is where it gets a little tricky. You need to know the gender of your noun or else you're going to be confused on what ending you're using for the adjective. Okay, so let's look at some examples. We have Cornelia est puella Romana, right? Cornelia is a Roman girl. Puella and Romana are both feminine, right? That's why they both have the A ending. Then you have Sextus et Marcus sunt pueri Romani. Now I'm saying Marcus and Sextus are Roman boys. I changed the gender to masculine because I'm talking about boys. So my ending, right, my adjective ending went from Romana, which is feminine, to Romani, which is masculine, right? It's matching pueri. And last, we have Edificium Romanum video. I see the Roman building. Right? Edificium and Romanum are the same gender. They're neuter, right? They're different from the first two. So we have a feminine form of Roman, Romana, a masculine form, Romani, and a neuter form, Romanum, right? Romana, Romani, and Romanum all mean the exact same thing. All three of those mean Roman. The only reason that they're spelled differently is because of the case, number, and gender of their noun. Remember, it has to match. Okay? So hopefully this makes a little bit of sense, and we're feeling pretty confident about it. Right? So if you're watching this video, you might be thinking to yourself, just every time we use an adjective, we just match the ending to its noun, right? Whatever ending the noun is using, that's the ending the adjective will use, right? That's what we saw in all those examples. We just had the exact same thing. It's not that easy. Okay, so you got to pause it right there. It doesn't quite work that way. We have to think about something else here. The thing we have to think about are declensions. And we made another video talking about the declensions for adjectives, right? The different types of adjectives, that's going to come into play here. So if you haven't watched it yet, I'd recommend you go back and watch that video so you can prep for what we're about to do right now. Okay? So it's a little trickier than you might think. There's a little extra step you need to figure out. A little puppy just to cheer you. Be fine. Don't worry. We'll take it one step at a time and you'll figure it out. Okay. So the first thing we have to do is remember what the declensions are for adjectives. Remember, we have two different types of adjectives. We have first and second declension and third declension. We call them that because first and second declension adjectives look very similar. They use the exact endings actually as first and second declension nouns. And third declension adjectives look very similar to third declension nouns. So it's just a way of organizing adjectives, just like we did with nouns. Same idea. We're just organizing them into two different groups. Okay. And when it comes to agreement, the declension of your adjective does not need to match the declension of your noun. That's a really important point. So feel free to pause the video here and write that down. They do not need to match in declension. So in other words, if I have a first declension noun, it doesn't need to go with a first and second declension adjective. That's not how it works. They can match however they want. But declension is important so that you can figure out the case, number, and gender. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. But first, like I said, it's totally fine to mix the declensions, right? There's no rules here. They don't have to match. So you can have a third declension adjective going with a first declension noun. It's totally, totally fine. And this is a really important point that a lot of my students stumble on. They think you have to stick within your declension. You don't. I know that sounds a little weird, but you don't have to. So for instance, you can totally say puella tristis, right? The sad girl. Puella, if you look at the dictionary entry below, right? The AE in the genitive singular makes it first declension. And then we have tristis, triste, right? Sad. It's a third declension adjective. Matching them is not an issue at all. So even though they look different, right? Puella and tristis do not have the same spelling. That's totally fine. They have the exact same case, number, and gender. So both of these words, puella and tristis, are both feminine singular nominative. Okay? So that's the only thing that matters here. So here's another important note. When you do happen to match declensions, right, you don't have to, but if you do, they're going to have the same ending, right, more often than not, especially for first and second declension, they're going to be the exact same thing, right? So if you happen to put a first declension noun with a first declension adjective, that's where you're going to end up with the exact same thing, right? That would be something like puella laita, like we talked about before, right? Puella laita means happy girl. You're going to have the exact same thing. Not a big deal, okay? When you have a noun and adjective that do not match, right, it's going to look very different. So in other words, if they're not actually matching the endings, you're going to see something like magni canes me terrent, right? The big dog scares me. Magni and canes are going together, right? They have the same case, number, gender, but it's because canis is a third declension noun and magnus is a first and second declension adjective. They don't look the same, but they are the same case, number, gender, right? Just like on the previous slide, if we had villa magna, right, the big house, villa is a first declension noun and magna was a first declension adjective. They're going to look the same. So that's the general idea. You're only worried about case, number, and gender, but if you do happen to match up the declension, you're going to notice that more often than not, the endings are going to be the exact same thing. Okay? This is probably a good time to pause for a second and reset the rules we've been talking about. So again, we said adjective match nouns in case, number, and gender. Declension does not matter. They don't need to match. Okay? It matters so you can figure out what the ending is, but they're not going to match. Okay? And the noun and the adjective do not have to have the exact same spelling. It sounds weird, but they don't need the same spelling. It's totally fine. Okay? So here's some steps for success. The first thing you want to do when you decide to use a Latin adjective and match it to a noun, or if you're translating, either way, the first thing you need to figure out is the declension of your noun, because that's going to help you figure out its case, number, and gender. So look at your noun, maybe look it up in the dictionary, figure out its declension, then you can figure out the case, number, and gender, which is step 2 of your noun, right? Get the case, number, gender. Then for step 3, use the exact case, number, and gender for your adjective, okay? So again, this all hinges on the noun because nouns don't change. Adjectives will match the noun. So you start with your noun and then make your adjective match it, and you're going to be totally fine, okay? So here's some examples, right? If I gave you legatus, lightus, laboravit, right? The happy legate worked. Legatus and lightus are going together, right? So legatus, you'll see up in the top right in red, it's a second declension noun, and lightus is a first and second declension adjective. This is the reason why they're using the same ending of us. Those are both masculine, nominative, and singular. The reason they have the same spelling is because they just happen to be the same declension, right? That's the only reason why. But case, number, and gender is really the important thing. Here we have agricola acer fuerat superbus, right? The fierce farmer had been arrogant, okay? So agricola and acer are going together, right? Agricola is a first declension noun. Acer, acris is a third declension adjective, while superbus, aum, is a first and second declension adjective, okay? So agricola, acer, and superbus all go together. All 3 of these are masculine, nominative, singular. They look a little different, but it's totally fine. The case, number, and gender is the exact same thing for all of these, okay? Next, we have soror piratarum, fortium fugere, right? The sister of the brave pirates, right? The piratarum will have fled, Okay, so piratarum is going with fortium. Fortium is your adjective, means brave, and it's matched or agreeing with, you might say, piratarum, right? The pirates. Both of those words are masculine, genitive, plural. Okay, the reason they don't quite look the same in terms of spelling is because you have a first declension noun, piratarum, going with a third declension adjective, fortis, fortis, forte, right? That's why the spelling is different, but the case, number, and gender is the exact same thing. Here we have inimicus per casam Corneliae fidelis fugere, right? The enemy, the inimicus, right, will have fled through the cottage of faithful Cornelia, Corneliae fidelis, right? So Corneliae and fidelis are going together. Cornelia is a first declension noun. Fidelis is a third declension adjective. The spelling is not going to be the same because the declensions are different, and that's totally fine. But they both match in case, number, and gender. So both those words are feminine, genitive, singular. So they match together. And it's a little jarring, again, that they're not spelled the same, but don't worry about it. They do actually match. Okay? And here's our last example. We have weary cum eudicibus, aegris laboraba. Right? The men, the weary, they will work with the sick judges, the eudicibus aegris. Okay? So we have eudex, a judge, eudicibus in this form, and it's being described with aiger, right? Aiger, aigra, aigrum. It's a first and second declension adjective going with a third declension noun, right? Judge. So because the declensions don't match, their spelling is different. But both these words are masculine, ablative, plural. So the case, number, and gender is the exact same, which means they're matching. Okay? So let's do a quick recap of everything we just learned on noun-adjective agreement. We said Latin adjectives match the nouns they're describing in case, number, and gender. So again, adjectives match the noun. Okay, the adjectives are like chameleons. They're going to be any gender depending on the noun they're going with, right? So they're going to match the noun, not the other way around. Then we said nouns and adjectives do not need to be in the same declension. Okay, it's totally fine to have a first declension noun with a third declension adjective. It doesn't make a difference. It's fine. When you do that, they're not going to be spelled the same, but they can go together. So any declension adjective can match any declension noun. It's totally, totally fine. And the trick here is, though, that they do not have to have the same spelling or ending, right? And oftentimes they don't. Right? So they're going to match case, number, and gender, but a lot of times they're not going to be spelled the same way, which is totally fine. And that's the trick that you need to get past when you're first really starting out in Latin, because it feels wrong, right? You're used to things looking the same and matching in Latin. It feels weird that they wouldn't here, but they don't. And this is why noun-adjective agreement is a little tricky for my students starting out. It takes a lot of practice to really master this. So I'd highly recommend you get out there, read as much as you possibly can. If you're using a textbook, do any practice problems you can find. If you're not, feel free to use the website Magistrula. That's where I pulled my examples from. Again, I don't own Magistrula at all. I just am a fan. But Magistrula will give you a lot of repetition on this. You can set it to use all sorts of adjectives, so you'll be totally fine. But the general idea, the more you read, the more you practice, the more comfortable you're going to be with this, and it'll stop being so scary, and you'll honestly get used to it, right? It's always a little bit tricky, just unless you have a really strong Latin vocabulary. But the idea is something you can master with practice, and then you'll just feel more comfortable with it. Okay? If you have any questions at all on this, feel free to put them in the comments. I'll help you out however I can. But otherwise, keep working, keep practicing, keep reading, and hopefully you're feeling better and better as you go. Good luck.